Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Ask Rob and Rob.
Hey everyone, welcome to Ask Rob and Rob, the show where you get your amazing questions in and we do our very best to give you a decent answer in return. We've done this a fair few times now, and we've also reminded you a fair few times of how you can get on the show. But just in case it's not landed yet, or you're new to us, let's give you a reminder.
Oh yeah, very simple. All you've got to do is go to propertyhub.net/ask. Then you have to leave us a voicemail, or you have to fill in a little form to send us a written question for the Sunday Times. But it all starts by going to propertyhub.net/ask. All right, let's have a listen to our first question.
Yeah, so hi Rob and Rob. This is Rob B from England. I love the work you do. Wonderful guys. The Northern one in particular. Gosh, he's a pretty switched on fellow. However, I'm so excited about your book launch, Rob D. And I was wondering, would you be kind enough to give a little preview to me and the rest of the listeners? Hope you're well, guys. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, mystery caller, for your question. I'm glad you're interested in the book. So the book is called 7 Myths About Money and the Truth About Finding Financial Freedom. And it's out this week. So you can order it right now. It's available as hardback, audiobook, and digitally. And in fact, if you order right now, just as this podcast comes out, you will still just about be in time to grab the pre-order bonuses. So if you go to 7mythsaboutmoney.com, then you'll be able to see what those bonuses are and then click through to either Amazon or Waterstones to buy it on the format of your choice. But let me see if I can give you a prompt in that direction by whetting your appetite a little bit. So I'll read you out a little section of the introduction. So the concept of this book is it's a personal finance book that is designed for today, for the world we live in now. And when I started digging into it, I realized that so much of the personal finance advice that we see comes from 100 years ago when the world was completely different. And even something that was true 20 years ago might not apply in the future because so much has changed. So in this part of the introduction, I'm talking about what has changed, why, and what I recommend as a result. It's clear that in the 40 years since the end of the gold standard ushered in a new financial era, the world had become hooked on cheap debt. For every crisis, the creation of ever more, ever cheaper debt was part of the solution. And in between crises, things seldom moved back in the opposite direction. Even by the beginning of 2020, 12 years on from the 2007-2008 collapse, interest rates had barely crept above their all-time lows. Meanwhile, the combined global debt levels of governments, businesses and individuals exceeded 250% of GDP, reaching a total of $226 trillion. Many people benefited from this era of ever higher, ever cheaper debt. But not everyone. The winners were those with assets. Stocks, bonds, and property all benefit from falling interest rates. Borrowing becomes cheaper, leading to increased demand for assets, which drives their prices up. In fact, they won twice over, because they could also borrow cheap money to get their hands on even more assets. The losers were, well, everyone else, going some way to explaining the yawning inequality gap that had opened up. But at least by the time the free money era got into full swing in the years after 2007, it was obvious how to play the game. Buy the biggest home you can as soon as you can, because debt was so cheap, it would be silly not to. Invest in the stock and bond markets, because both were only going in one direction, meaning that without trying too hard or taking on too much risk, a passive investor could enjoy double-digit annual returns. And with inflation being so low, there is no need to worry too much about the bite it would take out of your gains. As long as conditions stayed the same, so would the rules of the game. Of course, if interest rates reversed course, then there'd be some consequences to face. But those days were gone for good. Right? Wrong. It may not have been marked by a televised presidential announcement this time, like the end of the gold standard was 50 years ago, but another new era has begun. The financial world that we've lived in for most or all of our lives has changed, potentially forever, and this book is your guide to navigating it. Starting in the early years of the 2020s, the forces that had defined the world's economy for half a century, and which stepped up several gears following the financial crisis, screeched to a halt and reversed at a pace that took everyone by surprise. Inflation, which had been thought of as a problem of the past, returned with a vengeance. And suddenly, to combat it, interest rates rebounded from near zero all the way back up to their long-term average. As we'll learn in the chapters that follow, While the worst inflationary pressures of the early 2020s may have subsided, it's hard to imagine interest rates falling back to the historic lows that defined the world of the last few decades, nor inflation being brought fully under control for good. The easy money party is over, and the hangover that we're living through now could be a particularly painful one. For one thing, the embedded assumption that assets only rise in value has been shattered. The forces that pushed all asset prices upwards at the same time have abated, leaving us in for a far bumpier ride. For another, inflation will keep rearing up and threatening our living standards. On top of that, governments are less able to help than ever before, and may even be coming cap in hand asking you to help them instead. After all, governments now find themselves in the same position as the homeowner who used cheap money to buy a house they couldn't otherwise afford. Those trillions of dollars of debt will eventually need to be refinanced at higher rates, meaning that debt repayments will take up a larger share of tax revenue. Borrowing more money just to cover everyday commitments, as the US government has done in every year but 4 since 1971, and the UK government has done in every year but 5, suddenly seems less appealing. The only way out is through cutbacks, tax increases, and inflation. So it doesn't take a crystal ball or an economics degree for the average person who's already spent the past 50 plus years falling further behind to see that life is likely to get significantly worse. But there is a way out. My belief, and the case I'll make throughout this book, is that it is possible to thrive in this new economic era. It just involves forgetting a large amount of what you've been told and being prepared to bust a few myths. The word myth has several meanings. It can refer to a story passed down through the ages. It can mean a widely held but false idea. It can mean a deliberate misrepresentation of the truth or an idealized picture of it. Today, most of what you hear about money, even if once true, has taken on at least one of these qualities. The old school financial wisdom, much of which was already woefully out of date even by the turn of the 21st century, is now rooted in myth as much as in fact. It's a myth, for example, that savings are always going to come to your rescue when times get tough. What happens if inflation is higher than the interest rate paid by your bank? It's a myth that compounding returns are all you need for a happy retirement. What happens when the rate of compounding is lower than the old models would ever have predicted? And it's a myth that you should never try to beat the market. What if times are tough enough that doing so is the only way to get ahead? In this book, I'll be tackling the 7 biggest and most pernicious misconceptions, half-truths, and outright lies about money head on. And in debunking them, I'll sketch out an alternative route to financial independence, one that will help you thrive in the new reality of today's financial system. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a finance natural or any kind of guru. I've only come to discover this new path by trying out all the old advice, keeping the rare bits that succeeded, and filling the gaps with experiments inspired by some decidedly unconventional sources. For every one of my stranger money moves that worked, like posting banknotes to a stranger to buy Bitcoin before anyone beyond online weirdos had heard of it, or refusing to buy the home I live in despite presenting a show called The Property Podcast, I had 2 that didn't. It turns out that reflexively buying cheap shares in a company because everyone thought it was about to go bankrupt was ill-advised. Sometimes the majority is right. But over the past 15 years, I've studied the worlds of economics and personal finance intensively, questioning everything and learning which ideas about money are correct and which are nothing more than hearsay. Over time, this has developed into an alternative rulebook that has worked for me and which I've seen work for a huge number of others too. If it worked for them, and it worked for me, it might just work for you too. Okay, mystery caller, that is just a snippet of the introduction from the book 7 Myths About Money and the Truth About Finding Financial Freedom, which comes out this week. So if you want to go and grab the hardback, the digital version, or the audiobook, which I went and recorded professionally with a producer, so it wasn't just me stumbling through it now, it sounds really great, then you can do that. And remember, if you do it in the next couple of days, you are just about in time to grab the pre-order bonuses. So go to 7mythsaboutmoney.com, and from there you can click through to Amazon or to Waterstones and pick up your copy. Right, that is the end of me hijacking Ask Rob and Rob. We will be back with more, dare I say, legitimate questions next week, and we'll see you back here for the Property Podcast on Thursday. See you then. Bye-bye.